Ukraine is fighting a war for national survival, while Russia is fighting a war of choice. This dynamic could shift the longer the war goes on. As backing down becomes less of a possibility for Russia, the stakes of the conflict increase for its leadership. This creates a dangerous tension in which neither Russia nor Ukraine can countenance any result but total victory. This could escalate the conflict for both sides, spiraling toward the total war that many fear. In the early days of the war in 2022, NATO nations, led by the US, proved cautious in their support of Ukraine given concerns of escalation with Russia. However, Ukrainian battlefield successes coupled with Russian underperformance tempered those concerns. Heading into this winter, the Biden administration has taken a notably more aggressive stance. The warm welcome Zelensky received in Washington in December preceded the authorization of a record aid package and the deployment of Patriot missiles. The White House seems to understand that the war is entering a new phase. Although Putin, with his absurd claims of denazifying Ukraine, has often evoked the Second World War as a historical analog, Zelensky would be wise to look at Finland's victory over the Soviet Union in the Winter War as a strategic analog. Just as Putin's invasion of Ukraine was based on fears of NATO expansion, Stalin's invasion of Finland in November 1939 was based on fears of a non-communist, nationalist Finland along the Soviet Union's border, particularly given Hitler's aggression in Western Europe. Zelensky, unlike Putin, requires the support of an alliance to sustain his war. The member nations of that alliance are subject to the vicissitudes of their domestic politics. The war in Ukraine could just as easily be lost at an American or European ballot box as on the battlefield. Thus far, support for Ukraine has proved durable among allied nations. According to an October Ipsos poll, 73% of Americans believe the US should continue to provide military aid. A similar poll, taken in Europe, showed that 61% of Germans and 63% of the French support the war. On an icy Kyiv morning, inside an unnamed location with sandbags shielding the windows, Ukrainian drone specialist Pavlo Kastyuk holds up a 30-pound drone that Ukrainian forces captured from Russia. The Ukrainian government has also shown CBS News proof that similar components, from some Russian and Russian-modified Iranian drones retrieved by Ukrainian forces within the past 4 months, were produced by US companies Maxim and Microchip. Developed in the 1970s by the Soviet military, it currently utilizes 22 operational satellites in orbit. While it's available to civilian users, today it is crucial to Russia's ability to navigate military vehicles and launch drone strikes, both on the front line and in civilian areas in Ukraine. Ukrainian authorities say at least 6 US companies produce GLONASS-compatible chips. Yurchishyn has alerted US Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat Illinois. The senator's office told CBS News that American technology being used in Russian military drones is concerning, and that Durbin has raised it in meetings with administration officials. U-Blox, the maker of the Swiss chip that CBS News saw inside a Russian drone, says it cut ties with Russian companies at the start of the war. One way to reduce Russia's drone accuracy, both on the battlefield and in attacks on civilian areas, would be for companies to remove GLONASS compatibility from their components, says Andrew McQuillan, an expert in UAV security and the director of Crowded Space Drones in London. Russian drones would still be able to fly, he notes. Disabling GLONASS is not going to remove the entire problem, but it is going to make them much less accurate, he adds, emphasizing that their accuracy is what makes them such attractive weapons to the Russians. For now, Russia's drone attacks continue. Vladimir Putin's military has launched an estimated 600 at Ukraine since September. Earlier this week, Ukrainian forces shot down more than 80 Iranian-made drones in just 2 days, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Monday. Pavlo Kastyuk, the Ukrainian drone specialist, says he would like to speak to these American and European companies, whose parts are found in the rubble. Russian servicemen Sergei Sazonov, Gleb Pivkin, Russian Air Force Captain Andrei Stepovoy and Russian Air Force Lieutenant Yevgeny Glukhov are allegedly responsible for manning some of the Iranian-made kamikaze drones launched to attack Ukraine, according to a joint investigation by SleazeDVO.info and Nashi Grosher Lviv. The 4 reportedly belong to the 294th State Center for Unmanned Aviation of the Russian Defense Ministry. They allegedly underwent training in Iran in the summer of 2022, before Russia received its first batch of Iranian kamikaze drones. Russia uses Iranian-produced kamikaze drones, along with missiles, to attack critical infrastructure across Ukraine. Since early October, these repeated attacks have killed dozens of civilians and caused power, water, and heating cutoffs in multiple Ukrainian regions. President Volodymyr Zelensky said on December 19 that Russia had received a new batch of 250 Iranian drones. As of January 3 and since September 11, the Ukrainian military has shot down nearly 500 drones launched by Russia, according to Yuri Anat, the spokesman for the Air Force of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. He said on television that 84 of these drones were launched in the first 2 days of 2023, and all were downed. Ukraine's military estimated on Thursday that 800 Russian soldiers were killed in the past day, mostly in fighting in the eastern Donetsk region, while Western allies pledged supplies of armored battle vehicles but not the tanks Ukraine wants. More than 800 Russian soldiers, 1 aircraft, a helicopter and 3 tanks were destroyed over the past day. It also reported an unspecified number of civilian casualties as a result of Russian air, missile and rocket attacks on the largely ruined, Ukrainian-held city of Bakhmut and 2 other cities in the Donetsk region, Kostyantynivka and Kurakov. According to Yevgeny Balitsky, the governor of the Russian-held Zaporizhia region, Ukrainian artillery killed 5 people and wounded 15 including 4 emergency workers, Russia's TASS news agency reported. French President Emmanuel Macron told Zelensky France would send light AMX-10 RC armored combat vehicles to help the war effort, a French official said on Wednesday after the 2 leaders spoke by telephone. While the official said these would be the first Western armored vehicles delivered to Ukraine, Australia has given Kyiv 90 of its Bushmaster vehicles, an armored unit hardened against landmines and other threats. The Bradley armored vehicle, which has a powerful gun, has been a U.S. Army staple to carry troops since the mid-1980s. The U.S. Army has thousands of them, and they would give Ukraine more firepower on the battlefield and strengthen its ability in trench warfare. The United States is preparing another package of weapons, which could be announced in coming days on top of about $21.3 billion in security assistance so far to Ukraine. The United States has increased the capability of the weapons it has sent, including shoulder-fired Stinger anti-aircraft missiles as well as Javelin anti-tank missiles, the HIMARS rocket system and NASAMS surface-to-air missiles. During a visit by Zelensky to Washington last month, the United States pledged to send the sophisticated Patriot missile system to repel Russian missile and drone attacks. Russia launched its special military operation on February 24, citing threats to its security and a need to protect Russian speakers. Ukraine and its allies accuse Russia of an unprovoked war to seize territory. In a signal to the West that Russia will not back down over Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin sent a frigate on Wednesday to the Atlantic Ocean armed with new-generation hypersonic cruise missiles, which can travel at more than 5 times the speed of sound. The grueling Battle of Bakhmut lasts for 5 months, but Russian forces, despite insane pressure and massive losses, have not yet managed to capture the important city, the local transportation hub and one of key fortresses of Donbass. Their slow advances finally got them to the city's outskirts, in many ways due to their overwhelming artillery power. Russia initiated the Battle of Bakhmut in August, following the failure of its attempts to advance in other axes, particularly in Donbass. After 5 months of fighting, Russian forces near Bakhmut have only advanced between 6 and 12 kilometers east and south of the city. Since September, they have stood at the eastern outskirts of Bakhmut. But neither frontal attacks nor attempts to isolate the Bakhmut garrison from the north, via Soledar, and the south, via Kurdyamivka, have had limited results, although they put the city closer to the downfall. According to Ukrainian intelligence, in December, Russia had concentrated 40 battalion tactical groups and the largest artillery force in the area. After the Russian military's spectacular failures in Kharkiv and Kherson, the battle for Bakhmut has become the Kremlin's only realistic chance to get a victory that can be used to reinforce the pro-war propaganda. For this sake, the Wagner Group, headed by increasingly powerful Kremlin insider Yevgeny Prigozhin, is going as far as the mass recruitment of convicts in Russian prisons to be thrown in the meat grinder of Bakhmut. In December, it felt like Bakhmut might fall soon. Russian forces made gains south of the city, aiming to sever the vital road running west to the city of Kostyantynivka. Had they succeeded, Ukrainian forces would have to withdraw from the city to avoid a death trap. Russian forces managed to enter the eastern outskirts of Bakhmut in December. But on December 21, the day after President Volodymyr Zelensky made a surprise visit to the city, Ukrainian forces managed to carry out a tactical counterattack and drive Russia out of the city. And then on December 27, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence General Kyrylo Budanov was seen visiting his scouting troops deployed in Bakhmut just 600 meters from Russia's lines. Many indicators allege that Russia's pressure in Bakhmut is finally reaching its limits. Ukrainian forces are sustaining between 3 and 8 infantry attacks in the area daily, according to troops on the ground. But over the last few weeks, Russians were seen switching to using small squads of between 10 and 15 men instead of company or battalion-sized tactical groups. Another factor is the reportedly diminishing Russian artillery power. In late December, Budanov said that the daily spending of Russian artillery in combat dropped from 60,000 to between 19,000 and 20,000 rounds by the end of 2022. Moreover, according to the general, by March 2023, these issues will be even more obvious. On December 24, the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense also said Russian forces currently lack the necessary stockpile to support large-scale offensive operations and sustain defensive operations in Ukraine. Rumors on deteriorating munitions have been circulating for quite some time in Russian pro-war Telegram channels. An escalation came on December 27, when the Wagner Group released a video in which two militants insult Russia's Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov and accuse him of severe lack of artillery munitions in the Bakhmut area. Conflict Intelligence Team, CIT, an open-source investigations group, however, says the current situation is precipitated by poor and ineffective logistics rather than the physical absence of munitions in Russia's stockpile per se. Especially when it comes to Soviet standard munitions, the main stocks of which had been largely depleted back in summer. According to the 24th Brigade artillerists, at the beginning of Russia's war, each battery used to get up to 150 full loads of munitions a day, which corresponds to up to 6,000 rounds. Now they're getting only up to 30 full loads a day. The casings of spent 122mm charges lie next to a Ukrainian 2S-1 Gvozdika self-propelled howitzer in the countryside outside Bakhmut, Donetsk Oblast, on December 28, 2022, Francis Farrell/The Kyiv Independent. We need every single 122mm round anywhere in the world so we could go on helping our infantry. We do everything we can, but we don't have much ammo, Ukrainian artillerists say. According to the Institute for the Study of War, ASW, a US-based defense think tank, the depletion of the Russian stockpile will likely in part prevent Russian forces from maintaining a high pace of operations in the Bakhmut area in the near term. From the ISW's perspective, the most brutal battle of this war is likely culminating. Moreover, according to a British intelligence report issued on January 3, over the previous 10 days Ukraine had committed fresh reinforcements to the Bakhmut area. And Russian attacks by the Wagner Group intensified in mid-December, but were poorly supported. Almost no building is left intact. Some buildings are completely razed to ashes, with giant, meters-deep impact holes next to them. Most are damaged but still standing. The street signs wrecked with shell fragments still tell the story of vibrant life in the very recent past. According to the military-civilian administration responsible for the area, some 90% of residents have fled. But some 8,700 civilians out of a pre-war population of over 70,000 are still hiding in ruins. Off and on, Ukrainian tanks drive slowly through the streets of rubble and rusty anti-tank hedgehogs. All hell is breaking loose on the other side of the Bakhmutka River, which divides the city in half. Russians are standing just at the gates, but they have not broken through. A Ukrainian soldier takes cover from sniper fire in Bakhmut on December 28, 2022, Pierre Crom/Getty Images. The infantry of Bakhmut, sick, tired, full of bitter resentment, has its own point of view on what's going on with the most monstrous and dramatic battle of Russia's war. Soldiers gladly pass an opened bottle of whiskey to journalists. They are just dying to spend a minute talking to a new face before they have to move on. On New Year's Day, Ukraine used American-made rockets to kill dozens, and possibly hundreds, of Russian soldiers within its borders. Russian officials said the strike resulted in the deaths of 63 service members, while Ukrainian officials suggest the casualties are in the hundreds. It marks one of Ukraine's deadliest attacks on Russian forces in the war. Officials from both countries say that HIMARS rockets, which are satellite-guided weapons with a range of about 50 miles, were used in the attack. The US first provided Ukraine with long-range HIMARS rockets back in June. They offered roughly twice the range of the weaponry that Kyiv were previously using. HIMARS rockets have been integral for Ukraine in a defensive and offensive capacity in the war against Russia, experts say. HIMARS have liberated strategically significant Ukrainian cities and territory that likely otherwise wouldn't have happened, says George Barros, an analyst on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War. The US has supplied at least 20 HIMARS rockets to Ukraine. Their announcement to provide the weapons in June was part of a larger $700 million military aid package. US officials say that there are certain restrictions placed on the HIMARS rockets provided to Ukraine. They can't fire ATACMS missiles, which have a range of almost 200 miles. The US also sought Ukrainian assurances that HIMARS would not be fired into Russian territory. Some call for the US to continue to limit the kinds of weapons provided to Ukraine. As the war continues, Ukraine's access to effective weaponry will be key in shaping their response to Russian aggression. Even with the HIMARS, they are requesting Western allies to also provide them with tanks. The US has refused. Ukraine wants the United Nations to send peacekeepers to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant even without a deal with Russia to establish a safety zone there, the head of Ukraine's state nuclear power company said. Ukraine has called for UN peacekeepers at the site since September. But the comment was the first time a Ukraine nuclear official has suggested publicly peacekeepers should be deployed in the absence of an agreement to create a safety zone at the plant, which Russia took control of soon after invading the country on February 24. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, Europe's largest, has suffered repeated shelling and power cuts, raising concerns of radioactive catastrophe. Ukraine and Russia trade blame for the shelling. Rafael Grossi, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, had hoped to mediate an agreement between Russia and Ukraine on a safety zone by January. Petro Kotin, the head of Ukraine's state nuclear power company Energoatom, said the absence of a deal means the UN Security Council, of which Russia is a permanent member, should deploy peacekeepers. In October, Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a decree transferring the plant from Energoatom to a subsidiary of Russia's Rosatom, a move Kyiv said amounted to theft. In an internal meeting on Wednesday, Ukraine officials will discuss how to raise the peacekeeper issue to the Security Council, Kotin said. Russia has coerced 1,500 Ukrainian workers at Zaporizhzhia to sign contracts saying they now work for a unit of Rosatom, Kotin said. There are about 6,000 workers at the plant, compared to 11,000 before the war. Kotin said about 10% of the plant's Ukrainian operating staff were among those who signed contracts and the remainder were in non-operating roles. Shutdowns can be harmful to nuclear plants unless careful maintenance is performed, and Kotin worried that a breakdown in communications between staff and Energoatom due to Russia's activities could lead to the Zaporizhzhia plant's deterioration. REVE.ALED, the Director General of the European Union Military Staff, stated that Russia had lost 60% of the total reserve of military tanks during his speech in front of members of the National Assembly of France in November 2022. As per most accurate evaluations, at least 60,000 Russian soldiers were killed and 3 times as many wounded, which means that approximately 250,000 Russian soldiers are not capable of fighting at the moment. The Director General of the European Union Military Staff added that it is more complicated to evaluate losses on the Ukrainian side, and the EU believes that those are lower than Russia's but still significant. Russia has lost 60% of its tank stockpile as well as 70% of its missile reserve capable of hitting ground targets. Therefore, now Russia uses anti-aircraft missiles to hit ground targets, experiencing relevant issues with precision, and counts on receiving equipment from Iran or North Korea. He explained that it is hard to evaluate the shipments from Pyongyang, but Iran had already supplied UAVs to Russia at that moment. Negotiations on transferring medium-range ballistic missiles were also ongoing then. Blagian also named the EU evaluations, according to which Russia has lost 40% of armored combat vehicles and 20% of artillery since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He predicted a resume of active offensive operations by Ukraine in spring 2023. However, in order to do that, Kyiv needs to create 3 new army corps with approximately 75,000 men, the approximate number of the ground operative group of the French army. Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, believes that Russia is preparing another wave of offensive during its aggression against Ukraine. He has also warned against underestimating the impact of mobilization in the Russian Federation. Kirilo Budanov, the head of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, said in an interview to ABC News that Ukraine is planning a major offensive for spring, and the fiercest fighting is expected in March. This is when we will see more liberation of territories and dealing the final defeats to the Russian Federation. According to him, this will happen throughout Ukraine, from Crimea to Donbass. Our goal, and we will achieve it, is returning to the borders of 1991, like Ukraine is recognized by all subjects of international law, he emphasized. Budanov did not rule out further strikes on the territory of Russia, but did not specify who would be behind them. He added that the attacks would take place deeper and deeper inside Russia's territory, but also said he'd be able to comment on who carried out these strikes only after the end of the war. On January 2, Valery Zaluzhnyi, the commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, reported that during 2022, the Armed Forces of Ukraine killed over 100,000 Russian invaders, liberated 40% of the territories occupied during the full-scale invasion, and destroyed almost 42,000 Russian explosive devices. The unauthorized use of cell phones exposed the location of Russian troops to the Ukrainian military, prompting the weekend rocket attack that killed scores of Russians, a Kremlin official said Wednesday. Some Russians dismissed the explanation as an effort by the Kremlin to deflect blame from leadership. Lieutenant General Sergei Sevryakov said the death toll had risen to 89 service members, up from 63, in the Russian-controlled Ukrainian town of Makiyivka in eastern Ukraine. He said a commission was investigating the strike but that it has already become obvious at present that the main cause of the occurrence was activation and large-scale use, contrary to the ban, of personal phones by personnel within the reach of enemy's destruction means. Sevryakov said the Russian military is taking measures to ensure a similar incident does not happen again, adding that officials responsible would be punished. The attack was among the most deadly Russia has faced in a war that has dragged on for more than 10 months with no indication it will soon end. The British Defence Ministry, in an assessment Wednesday, noted that the extent of the damage indicated a realistic possibility that ammunition stored near troop accommodations exploded during the strike, creating secondary blasts. Unconfirmed Ukrainian reports put the death toll from the weekend rocket strike much higher. The Strategic Communications Directorate of Ukraine's armed forces claimed Sunday that about 400 mobilized Russian soldiers were killed in a vocational school building. The Russian regiment's deputy commander was among the dead, according to the nation's defense ministry. In Samara, in southwestern Russia, locals on Tuesday gathered for a memorial. Unconfirmed reports in Russian-language media said the victims were mobilized reservists from the region. Andrei Medvedev, Russian TV host, dismissed the explanation in a message on Telegram, calling it a reflection of the adage that cities are taken by soldiers while wars are won by generals. Ukraine plans a major offensive for spring, and fighting could be hottest in March, Ukraine's military intelligence head said Wednesday. This is when we will see liberation of territories and dealing the final defeats to the Russian Federation, Kyrylo Budanov told ABC News in an interview in Kiev. This will happen throughout Ukraine, from Crimea to the Donbass. Budanov said the U.S. Bradley armored fighting vehicles will significantly improve the Ukraine military's combat ability. The Ukrainian leadership has repeatedly said it will sign no peace deal that involves land concessions. That includes Crimea, which Russia has occupied since 2014. Ukraine's state grid operator Ukrenergo said that it has established power consumption limits across the nation and that emergency outages will be introduced if the limits are exceeded. Consumption has increased because of colder weather and increased business operations after the winter holidays, the company said in a statement. Energy facilities in the eastern part of the country had come under frequent attack from Russia, causing significant damage, the statement said. Parts made by more than a dozen U.S. and Western companies were found inside an Iranian drone downed in Ukraine last fall, CNN reported, citing a Ukrainian intelligence assessment the media outlet said it obtained. Of the 52 components Ukrainians removed from the Iranian Shahid 136 drone, 40 appear to have been manufactured by 13 American companies, the others by companies in Canada, Switzerland, Japan, Taiwan, and China, according to the assessment. The weapons research group Conflict Armament Research issued multiple reports last year citing the use of Western parts in the drones, and the White House has created a task force aimed at cutting off the supply of Western-made parts to Iran. There will likely be further strikes into Russian territory, Ukraine's military intelligence head, Kyrylo Budanov, told ABC News in an interview from Kiev, without specifically saying whether Ukraine would be behind them. Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for the December 26 attack on Russia's Engels Air Force Base, which is located more than 800 miles from the Ukrainian border, but Budanov admitted he was glad to see it. And when asked about attacks on Crimea, which was illegally annexed by Russia in 2014, Budanov said, "Crimea is Ukrainian territory, we can use any weapon on our territory." In late December, Budanov made a public appearance in Bakhmut in Donetsk, the hottest point of the 800-mile front line. What he saw shocked him. Budanov said Russia's weaponry is depleting, forcing it to resort to cheaper, more plentiful solutions, like the Iranian-made, self-destroying Shahid drones, which have sowed fear and panic in the population. Russia fired 84 drones at Ukraine in the first 2 days of 2023, all of which were shot down by Ukrainian air defenses. The US announced it would supply a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine in late December, bringing the Biden administration's total military aid for Ukraine close to $22 billion. President Joe Biden recently signed a $1.7 trillion government funding bill that includes $47 billion of additional aid for Ukraine. Budanov also said they are expecting U.S. Bradley armored fighting vehicles to be sent to Ukraine soon. "We are waiting for them. We're looking forward to them very much. This will significantly improve the combat ability of our units." Budanov said he expects fighting to be the hottest in March, adding that Ukraine is planning a major push in the spring. The Ukrainian leadership has repeatedly said it will not give up an inch of territory. "Our goal, and we will achieve it, is returning to the borders of 1991, like Ukraine is recognized by all subjects of international law," said Budanov. "Putin's regime is a laughingstock for everyone," Budanov said, adding the Russian troops are all but reduced to defending territories they still occupy within Ukraine and not for much longer. "The only issue remaining," Budanov said, "is Russia's nuclear arsenal and the uncontrollable regime that will lead the whole world to realize the necessity of Russia's denuclearization or at least an international overseeing of its nuclear arsenal." Moments after the interview ended, Budanov warned our team that rockets had been fired at Kyiv from the Black Sea. Hours later, Russia unleashed another massive aerial attack against Ukraine, ringing in 2023 with terror. In the West, for a long time, the Russian leadership, Putin's elite, with the help of their agents of influence and lobbyists in business and politics, formed several theses. Since March 2014, Henry Kissinger and a number of other consultants to American politicians have been saying that the page on Crimea has already turned, and that this should be forgotten. Let's not forget that in 2016, immediately after the victory of Donald Trump in the presidential election, Ukrainian businessman and philanthropist Viktor Pinchuk wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal calling on Ukraine to give up Crimea for the sake of peace. Pinchuk tried to play on the feelings of the American establishment, namely the part that continued to believe that Russia is a great power which should remain a guarantor of security and cooperation, at least in Eastern Europe, and most of all in Europe in general. If Crimea does not return to Ukraine, it will look like a reward for Russia for aggression. The fact that a nuclear state gave guarantees of security and territorial integrity to a non-nuclear state in exchange for the latter forfeiting its nuclear arsenal, the third largest in the world. Moreover, Russia used Crimea to prepare an attack on Ukraine, and it is possible that it could use Crimea, hypothetically, because it is difficult to imagine that Crimea will remain in Russia, to deploy nuclear weapons there. In addition, Crimea is unique in another way, in that if it remains in Russia, it means that trade in the Black Sea, grain exports and imports we need, will be constantly under threat. From all points of view, military, economic, and strategic, Ukraine must regain Crimea, and Russia must be punished for its aggression, including in Crimea. The head of Ukrainian intelligence recently spoke about the return of Crimea, in a combined way, both by force and diplomacy. Dozens of Russian military personnel were killed after Ukraine bombed a school building which Russia had almost certainly taken over for military use, according to the UK Ministry of Defense. Moscow confirmed that 89 of their troops died following the New Year's Eve strike in the Russian-held town of Makiyivka near the Ukrainian city of Donetsk. Russia blamed unauthorized use of cell phones by their soldiers for the attack. The phone signals allowed Ukrainian forces to determine the coordinates of the location of military personnel, the Russian military said in a statement late Tuesday. The strike, and resulting loss of life, is a massive blow to Vladimir Putin as the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine approaches. Speaking to security workers in a video address, he acknowledged the ongoing situation in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, 2 of the 4 Ukrainian areas Russia has illegally annexed, is extremely difficult. Moscow is said to have lost up to 100,000 troops throughout the war, with remaining soldiers running low on morale and basic supplies. Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the UK's Chief of Defence Staff, also predicted in mid-December that the war will only get worse for Russia as the cupboard is bare.